Hello again, everybody. This is Dan Clouser, and welcome back to the Journey of My Mother's Son podcast. I'm joined with best-selling author Laura DeSisto. Laura, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the conversation. I don't think I've ever had someone on the show who has swam with sharks before, so this is a first. But before I give away too much of your story, and we start the conversation, just introduce yourself to my listeners. Who is Laura today?
Sure. So as you said, my name is Laura DeSisto. I have been a writer my whole life, professional writer. I was an English major, and as soon as I graduated, I started working in advertising as a copywriter. I eventually transitioned into writing feature articles for magazines. But my goal always from the time I was a little kid was to write a book. And the way that transpired is just about 10 years ago, my youngest child left the nest. We had 3 kids, and the youngest one was like bound and determined to go to boarding school as a freshman in high school. And we really didn't want him to go, but he fought tooth and nail. I think he just didn't want to be home alone without his siblings. And so we eventually relented. But unfortunately, the year that he left was the same year that the middle daughter left to go to college. And so I just fell off a cliff. I mean, I just felt like my life lacked purpose. I had been a freelance writing all along when the kids were at home, but I really identified mostly as a mother and was very active raising the children. So I kind of went into a depression. In hindsight. When you're in a depression, I don't think you necessarily know it at the time, but in hindsight, I think I was depressed and just kind of wandering around the house in my robe and, going into empty kids' rooms and crying. My husband was, still young and working full time, and I was really very much alone. And what changed all that is my neighbor, who was one of my best friends, still is, we call her Buffy, that's her nickname. She was is an avid scuba diver, and she and her husband and teenage son were traveling all over the place diving. And I'd always wanted to dive, but I was deathly afraid of sharks. But she caught me in a weak moment, and she said, let's go on a dive trip to the Bahamas. Let's just do like a long weekend. And off we went. And the rest is history. I absolutely fell in love with diving. It allowed me to reconnect with parts of myself that I had lost when I became a mother. I kind of I don't know, I was just such a courageous child. I was so physically brave and a daredevil, and that kind of all slid away when I was raising the kids. And it just revived me, which is why I titled my book, which is a memoir, Resurfacing, because I felt like it allowed me to resurface into my own life.
Yeah, I love that. So, I've done a little bit of snorkeling in my life. I actually scuba dived once down off the Florida Keys with my uncle, and it is a pretty amazing experience, but I never came face to face with a shark like you have at times. So, tell me a little bit about, first of all, how did you overcome the fear of you said you wanted to do it, but you're always just deathly afraid of doing it. Yes. So what was that process like, with kind of all this other stuff going on in the background, battling depression, kind of trying to find your new identity from just, identifying as a mother for all these years to now all of a sudden, all your kids are out on their own, and, you're really trying to rediscover who you are. What was that process like for you, and how did you overcome that to say, all right, let's just do it. We're going to, put on the wetsuit and jump in the water.
I was very naive. I did not realize that we were going to see sharks on our very first dive in the Bahamas. It was, if you've been diving that one time, you know that there's a program called Discover Scuba that's through PADI, which is an acronym for the Professional Association of Diving Instructors. And so if you go to, a PADI certified resort or dive shop, they are allowed to take you out. They do like a little pool training. And then they, if you're comfortable, they just take you right out into the open ocean and off you go with the dive instructor. It's kind of crazy now that I think of it, that they allow you to do that with so little training, but they're right there with you. And so we did this, and I never asked anybody if we were going to see sharks. I don't know why I assumed we wouldn't. I think partly it was because Buffy knew I was really afraid of sharks, and she'd been diving at this place. And I thought she would have said to me like, hey, you're going to see a shark, so stay calm. But I kid you not, on that very first dive, we got down to the bottom. We were at maybe 50 or 60 feet. I was with the dive instructor. His name was Steven. And we had kind of settled down at the back of this large coral head. And I saw a dark shape in the distance coming towards us. And I thought, I don't know what I thought. Maybe I thought it was like a ray or something. And as it got closer and closer, it became clear that it was a shark. And I honestly thought I was going to have a heart attack. I could feel my heart beating out of my chest, and it got closer and closer. It closed in on us. And I'm looking at the dive instructor, waiting for him to make a move. Like, is he going to grab me? Are we going to like go to the other side? Like, what are we going to do? What's the plan? I have no plan. I don't even know how to scuba dive. And he didn't do any of that. So I kid you not, it came this close to my face, and then it turned. And I looked at the instructor. He was perfectly calm. And in that moment, something changed in me. Something clicked in me. I realized, coming face to face with it, it had no interest in biting us. It was genuinely curious. And, I've come to learn a lot about sharks since then. And what I've learned is that, especially reef sharks, which this is a reef shark, they tend to live in a particular area in a reef, and you're a visitor there. So they come to check you out. Are you competition? Are you going to go after the same food as me? What are you doing in my environment? Just like you and I would do if somebody walked into your home. So he was just simply checking us out. And once he kind of sized us up, he was done. But there was something so magnificent about this shark. In a weird way, I felt connected to God in that moment. I've always felt this way about large predators. I feel the same way about grizzly bears. I feel the same way about alligators. I'm fascinated by them. And for whatever reason, when I'm around that kind of power, I feel that it's a God thing. I don't, maybe it's just me, I don't know. But we resurfaced like my book. And I was like high as a kite. And all I kept saying was, I'm going to come back. I want to do this. I want to get certified. I'm hooked. And I was hooked. So I went back down to the Bahamas to get my dive certification within a month. And that's a longer process, obviously, than just, a one-day training in the pool. So that's a long answer, but that's how I reacted to seeing a shark for the first time.
No, I love that. And I completely understand, what you're saying is, as a God thing. I mean, I do a lot of hiking, so I'm out in nature, and I've never come, face to face with, a quote unquote life-threatening animal, a bear, or anything like that. But, there are times where, when you see something in its own environment like that, and like you said, you're a visitor at that point, and
Mm-hmm.
you're in their backyard, so to speak. It really gives you a different appreciation just for life and creation in its own right. So I can definitely relate to that. So from from that first dive, and then wanting to go and get certified, how did that process then eventually lead you to writing your memoir?
Mm-hmm.
Again, you've written your entire life. You're a freelance writer, but you never, again, kind of jumped in, no pun
Mm-hmm.
intended, and decided to write a book. So throughout this whole transformation process, what was it that said, what, I'm going to put this on paper, we're going to do a memoir, and led you down that path?
That's a good question. So I would say a couple of things. First of all, I had little books started in these notebooks that were strewn all over my house for years. I'd have an idea and I'd go to the store and I'd buy a fresh new notebook and I'd write 20 pages and then I'd forget about it and put it in a drawer. And I think the reason is because I didn't feel energized by the material. I didn't feel excited about it. So one thing was that I felt like I had material now because other things have happened during this time period, a very short span of time. A really close friend of mine who was more like a sister was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Her husband left her in the middle of that. And my friends and I took care of her. At the same time, my husband eventually became a certified diver. We started going down to the Bahamas all the time. We spent a whole winter down there. Eventually my husband retired. We really got into the whole diving thing. We became very close friends with some people in the Bahamas, native Bahamians. And one of these Bahamians was a young man. We met him when we met him. He was 18, met him at the dive shop. He was training to be a dive instructor. And unfortunately, when Hurricane Dorian hit the island, the island of Grand Bahama, which is where he's from, it devastated his family. I don't want to give too much away because I'd love it if people read my book, but it was a huge tragedy. And so we eventually took him back here to go to college and, to pick up the pieces of his life. And so the sisterhood part of the book, the subtitle is My Friend. The sharks is obvious. And then the storms is, the Hurricane Dorian and what happened to this island that we had fallen in love with after all this time. And also metaphorical storms in your life. So there was just so much that happened that I just thought, I can't not write about this. And honestly, the writing was so much easier this time because I had all this material that I had lived through, right? I had all this lived experience. And so that's the first answer to your question. And then the second answer is that the experience of diving and facing my fear of sharks and also, finally engaging in this activity that I had dreamed about my whole life. I had wanted to dive until I saw Jaws, and then that put an end to it. I love Jacques Cousteau. I'd go in like pools and I'd go under the water and pretend that I was, the woman on the show. So kind of reviving this dream of writing a book helped me to, reviving this dream of scuba diving also revived my childhood dream of writing a book. So really cool that they dovetailed in this way. And so what I would say to your listeners is that my life lesson, my takeaway from this is that if you muster the courage to tackle one thing in your life, it will bleed into all other areas and it will enrich your life and allow you to have the courage to try other things, to go after other dreams or to confront other challenges.
I love that. Absolutely love that. So the process, from being someone who, essentially wrote articles for magazines, probably, I'm assuming, 1,500 to 2,000 word articles in most cases.
Exactly.
To transform that into a full book, what was, what had to take place into your psyche to say, okay, this is, because really there's a part of you that it's like, I'm just writing a bunch of articles that are going to be put together and they're now going to be called chapters. But, was there a point where you're looking at like, man, do I have enough to put a whole book together when you're more used to writing? You were more a sprinter than you were a marathon runner at that point. So what was that change in psyche like as far as the writing process itself?
That's a really insightful question, Dan, because well, you're a writer yourself, and so you understand the challenges of just getting the sheer number of words down that you need to get down to call something a book, right? So what I struggled with was I would sit down and write what I thought was a chapter or a section, and then I would start to go back and edit it. And, you know, as you've probably experienced yourself, when you do that, you end up in an endless loop. And I think part of the reason why we do that is because it's frankly easier to edit than it is to produce new words.
Yeah.
And it's, for me, it's more fun. So I ultimately hired a book coach to help me break free of that cycle. And he gave me such great advice. He said, you are not going to go back and edit one word of this until you have at least 60,000 words down, because that's the minimum that you should have for a memoir. Don't do it. Don't go back and edit. So that was one really good piece of advice he gave me. And then the other was to try to write at the same time in the same place every day, which starts to prep your brain to be creative in that space and time. And I just had to trust him on that one. I wasn't sure I believed him, but man, did that work. I just really found that to be the case. It was weird. I was going to the local library and I would just sit there in the same chair. And it was like, I'd open up my laptop and it would just spill out of me. So that was really good advice. So I would say, but to your point, yes, there was a point where I decided, you know what, I'm just going to consider this chapter a magazine article that I have to write. And I'm going to think of it that way, as a self-contained unit. And then after it's all done, you start to reread it, you start to have to stitch together the pieces.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise it would just be short stories.
And it's interesting you said about, going to that same place, to find creativity. We were down in Key West in the beginning of 2021 and went to Ernest Hemingway's house. And, as we were doing the tour there, they talked about how Hemingway, daily would, get up early in the morning and, walk from his bedroom over to, his office, which was just, across the way in his estate there. And he would write every day from 6 a.m., 10 a.m., approaching it, almost as a job, so to speak, which I just found fascinating because that's not my style of writing. Like I'm very, you hear people talk about sometimes they're not sure if you find creativity or if creativity finds you. Mm-hmm. And for me, I'm definitely one who I feel as though, creativity finds me. So if all of a sudden I wake up in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm inspired to write, like I have to write. And it's so weird for me. So that was something that I couldn't personally kind of wrap my head around as far as, the way Hemingway approached it as truly like a job, he was going there. Cause I can imagine there are times where he went over there for those 4 hours in the morning that he dedicated to his craft and probably sat and looked at an empty sheet of paper for several hours at that point. And then all of a sudden you start doing it anyway. I mean,
well, it's really, really strange that you brought Hemingway up. I just opened up the Kindle version of my book. I'm going to put this up to the screen to see if you can see what it says. Is it showing up backwards?
No, write hard and clear about what hurts. Wow.
That's the opening to my book. And the reason for that is that we spent a lot of time in Bimini, which is another island in the Bahamas, because that is one of the few places in the world that you can still dive with great hammerheads. Great hammerheads are an endangered species. They're enormous. They're like 18 feet long. And they happen to live in one particular end of Bimini. And so there's companies that will take you to dive with them. And I didn't realize when we went to Bimini how much Hemingway history is there, because as you probably know, he was a big game fisherman.
Yeah.
And so he spent so much time in Bimini because the the fishing there was so good. In fact, he wrote a story that's based in Bimini. And we went to this little museum, which is also in my book. And we went into the little gift shop, and I happened to pick my head up. And that quote from Hemingway was on the ceiling of the gift shop. So I took a picture of it. And when I sent my book to the editor, I had other quotes there on the first page. She said, no, take those out. Just leave the Hemingway one. And I did, a lot, there's a lot of pain in this book, as there is in any memoir. If you're going to be vulnerable and true, then you're going to be writing about your joy, your pain, your human experience. So it isn't all like, oh, wow, I dove with sharks and now I'm this changed person. Isn't this wonderful? I mean, as I said, there's, the hurricane, there's my friend's cancer. I mean, there's everything. And I had to learn to be really vulnerable. That's the other thing about memoir. When I first sent the first draft to the editor, she said, nope. She kept in red, she'd write, what were your thoughts and feelings about this? This isn't a novel. This isn't a blow-by-blow description of what you did. This is your lived experience of that moment. How did you feel about the situation in that moment? So I had to dig deep. And at times I wasn't sure that I was going to be comfortable with that. Exposing myself like that, exposing details about my family of origin, about, really painful things that happened with my mother and my stepmother. And it tore me up, but it was also really therapeutic. So I'd say, like, even I think everybody should write one. And even if you never publish it, because, when you're ready to revisit those moments in your life, when you're in a place when you can do that, it's really therapeutic. I wouldn't recommend it if you're in a bad spot. It might just make things worse, but I had enough distance from it that I was able to do it.
Yeah, that's funny. You actually just answered my next question, which was going to be, did you find the writing process to be therapeutic for you or cathartic? And, you've already answered that, because I know for me, it was the same way. And I think that's why, a lot of people journal, and why journaling is so important, because it is a form of therapy, and let's face it, not everybody is comfortable, sitting down and talking to an actual therapist. Some of that's just not their cup of tea. But I think writing and journaling can definitely, take the place of that, because you're still getting it out, you're still getting your thoughts out there, and you're still, it becomes a healing process to put that on paper. So like I said, you answered that, that question for me already, and the fact that it was, cathartic and therapeutic for you. But how tough was it to, you touched on a little bit, but the process of saying, okay, I am going to be vulnerable. I am going to, show some of these wounds, to the world. How difficult of that process was it, accepting that, okay, I'm going to be vulnerable in this?
So it was definitely hard. I think what's so fascinating is that the moments where I was writing and I was crying or really questioning whether I should put this out there, those are the places in the book where I get the most feedback from people, whether they know me or not. They might write a review or send me an email if they find me online and just say, I want you to know that, when you described what it was like to metaphorically let your children go on the shore in the Bahamas, because I have this scene where I was doing the dive trip, and it just kind of struck me like, my children are grown. Like, it's time to kind of like cut the apron string or the umbilical cord. I bawled as I was writing that, and people recognize the vulnerability there. That's one scene that people talk about a lot. There's another scene in a cemetery in the Abacos where I'm with my friend Tracy, who has breast cancer. That's another place where I got really vulnerable. People bring that up all the time, that scene. So people can sense your authenticity in a book. They really can. And what's crucial, I think, in a memoir is to make sure you're writing about how you feel about it. I was challenged in the sense that, in a sense, I was writing about my friend, and I didn't want to tell her story because it wasn't mine to tell. So the editor made it clear to me. She said, you're not telling her story. You're telling the story of how you felt witnessing what was going on with her. So I just kept circling back to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so important, that, that is truly what a memoir is. It is, your perspective of things that happened, whether directly or indirectly, to you. So I think that's an interesting point to bring up for sure. Another thing I think is, vulnerability truly is bravery. You get right down to it. And I think, part of, what we go through when we're writing that way, and why we kind of feel so fulfilled when someone does reach out and say, I can really relate to this portion of what you wrote here, is, there's safety in numbers, and people, when you can relate to someone without knowing who you're going to relate to in that moment that you're writing it, and you get that feedback, that positive feedback that it did resonate with someone. I know for me, that's incredibly fulfilling, but what is your reaction when you get that feedback from one of your readers?
Oh man, I mean, I've cried. It's so meaningful. I think for most people, when they write a book, they have reasons why they're doing it. And it could be an endless number of reasons. Sometimes though, there's surprises after you've done it. There's gifts that you unwrap that you didn't really think about.
Yeah.
And that's one of them, is getting the reaction from readers, and feeling like you've touched someone is probably, for me, has been the most rewarding part of this whole process. Other really cool things, like, I put it on Facebook, and a few of my high school friends read it and reached out to me and said, we never knew you were going through all that in high school. We had no idea. So, it's kind of like that old expression, be kind to people because you never know what battles they're fighting. That's true of us all.
Yeah, it is. Definitely is. Are there, you think there's any more books in your future at this point?
I would really like to write a thriller based on a true story. My husband and I built a house maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And unfortunately, just as it was being finished, our direct next door neighbor, who we'd gotten to know and befriended over the process of building the house, was murdered in his home. And it was a very violent murder and just awful, and ended up making me feel so uncomfortable that we had to sell the house and move. And it was like our dream house. It was gorgeous. It was right on the water. It was kind of like surrounded by conservation land. So it just had this kind of trees on the side, and then this view directly out to the water. And I had to leave. So I think we owned the house for 3 months or something. And so I kind of wanted to write a true story about it, because there's so many layers to it. There's so many crazy things that we found out afterwards. And in fact, they caught the guys who did it. And my youngest son ended up working in a company with a woman who sat on the jury. And I don't know how he and she made the connection, but they did. And I went out and had coffee with her. So I heard all this stuff that I didn't even know was going on, which is so cool. And in fact, I had a chapter about this in my book, because it happened at the same time that we were learning how to dive and do all this stuff. And the editor wrote to me and said, it's fascinating, but I don't think it belongs in this book. I think you should write a different book about it. So I took it out, I saved it. And I think I would like to do, like I said, like a thriller based on a true story. So I have some chapters written on that. And again, I think I have enough material to work with that I can elaborate on, or, and add to and subtract, that it won't be as difficult to write if I were just starting from scratch and didn't have the experience. So, and now I know I can do it. That's the main thing. Once you write a book, like any of your listeners out there, if you're thinking about writing a book, once you do one, it's just like riding a bike. Like, I have the confidence now that I can pump out that number of words and I can polish it.
Yeah, no doubt about that, for sure. Laura, is there anything, we're just about out of time here, is there anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to tell the listeners about?
I would say, the only thing I would say is, I really love connecting with people, and I really love connecting with my readers. And you can find me at lauradesisto.com. I'm sure you'll probably have it in the show notes. It's just my name.com. If you go to my website, right at the front, I think it says enter your email to connect with me. You can also email me at lauradesisto.com. So if anyone ever has a question about whatever, sharks, diving, writing a book, I really like to make time for people, just as people have made time for me when I was writing my book. I couldn't get over the generosity of many authors who took the time to talk to me and answer my questions. It's a really wonderful community. So that's one thing. You can connect with me on Instagram. I frequently post stories about our dive adventures. We actually went to the Big Island of Hawaii last December, and we did a night dive with manta rays, and that was on my bucket list. So if you're on my Instagram, I think it's 5 or 6 posts down. I'm at Laura_N as in Nancy _DeSisto on Instagram, and I'm really active on there. I guess that's probably it.
Love it. Love it. So, Laura, that brings me to my final question. And as you know, the subtitle of the podcast is Many Little People in Many Little Places, which comes from the opening lyrics of a Michael Franti song, Gloria, which go, when many little people in many little places do many little things, then the whole world changes. What's one of the little things that Laura does on a daily basis to make the world a little bit better place?
Oh, I really, really make an effort to be kind. I just don't think we have enough kindness in this world. I try to be overly patient if, somebody's having a bad day at the grocery checkout, or, somebody cuts me off, or I just really do believe that the energy that we put out there spills out, onto other people. Sometimes I'll do the thing where you buy the coffee in line for the person ahead of you, or behind you rather. I just think that's really an undervalued thing. There's small gestures, but it has like these concentric circles. Like if you're kind to somebody and then they can spread that to someone else, and, the next hour or whatever, it can change the world. So it doesn't sound significant, but I actually think it is.
I think it's very significant. I love that answer. Folks out there listening, be sure to check out my other podcasts and blogs at journeymymotherson.com or danclouser.com. While you're there, pick up a copy of my most recent book, Journey My Mother's Son, Volume 1. And while you're on the internet, head over to Amazon, pick up a copy of Laura's book as well. Laura, I really appreciate you having on the show. This is a great conversation. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.